Did you know that the eastern part of the former Second Polish Republic was in full control by the Soviet Union from 1939 till the outbreak of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941? While most Polish people ended up under German rule after the German invasion of Poland, a great deal of Poles ended up under Soviet rule. So how's life for them? Well, not pleasant. In this video we're going to talk about the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland. Stay tuned. I'm now in the eastern Polish city of Białystok, and this city had a very turbulent history. It was first occupied by the Russians till the outbreak of the First World War, because then, during the First World War, the Germans occupied it. Then, in 1918, World War I came to an end. After this, the Polish authorities took it over. Yet, the Red Army, who launched their offensive to get to the west during the Polish-Soviet War, occupied the city for a short while, and after this, it became part of Poland once again. Then, in 1939, the Germans invaded Poland from the west. The Polish army was crumbling under the German onslaught. But if you think that things couldn't get any worse, well, yes, they could. Because after 2.5 weeks, the Soviets joined the fray. They invaded Poland from the east. Why did the Soviets join in? Well, in the month before the attack, in August 1939, they signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. Not only that, also spheres of influence, I can rather say occupation, were decided. And eastern Poland could be occupied by the Soviets as the Nazis agreed. The Soviet invasion of eastern Poland happened fairly swift, since the bulk of the Polish army was fighting the Germans and was already falling apart because of the German onslaught. When the Soviets marched in, they had some skirmishes with Polish troops here and there, but eventually they managed to occupy it and lost around 1,000 men in the process. Stalin's excuse was that he wanted to protect the non-Polish people in the eastern Polish regions. Now, this excuse was obviously nonsense, but it is true that in the eastern part of the Second Polish Republic, many non-Polish people, think of Belarusians and Ukrainians, were living. And the Soviets, they capitalized on this. In eastern Poland, the population was about 43% Polish, 33% Ukrainian, and 8% each Jewish and Belarusian, with a small number of Czechs, Germans, Russians, Roma, Tatars, and others. But now, everyone from every nation and every class would have to express a ritualized support of the new order. Let's take a look at the political situation first. The eastern parts of Poland were annexed and added to the Belarusian SSR and the Ukrainian SSR, except for the Vilna region. That area was granted to Lithuania. However, shortly after, Lithuania itself was annexed by the USSR. Prisoners were emptied, and political prisoners, usually communists, were put in charge of local government. Soviet agitators urged peasants to take revenge on landlords. Though most people resisted the call to criminality, chaos reigned as thousands did not. Mass murders with axes were suddenly frequent. So let's zoom in what happened in this region. The Soviets started forming provisional governments, which in theory were independent, but in reality are under close watch by the government. Provisional boards of the provinces in cities were set up. Members of these boards were carefully selected dedicated Bolsheviks from eastern Belarus, who had to oversee the establishment over the sovietization of the area. They supervised the formation of peasant associations in villages and led the legal annexation of the territory to the Soviet Union. On October 22nd, there was a voting day. This was obviously not done in secrecy and was a sham. Mid-November, the annexation process was complete. Simultaneously, cultural and educational institutions were transformed to Soviet model. Agricultural reforms, it aimed at expropriating big landowners, and nationalization of industry and banks took place. Theaters, cinemas, and libraries were used to spread communist ideology on the new citizens.
начался парадом частей рабоче-крестьянской Красной Армии.
The Soviets issued registration, and this ensured that 150,000 men, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles and Jews, were drafted in the Red Army. This also made it possible for the Soviets to pinpoint those the system deemed a threat for their communist ideology. The NKVD brought in notorious thugs to run the new prisons that sprang up all across the region, where they routinely tortured everyone who fell in their hands to force out names of yet other victims. When the usual instruments of interrogation were lacking, they improvised. Prisoners were beaten with railings broken from fences, their hands were crushed in the doors of their cells, thin books were placed on their heads, which were then beaten with hammers to induce concussion rather than fracture. When they were dragged, crushed in body and spirit before NKVD kangaroo courts, they were subjected to further indignities.
Мы в зале Народного суда города Львова. Советские судьи, товарищи Мирре, Малыгина, Цинс. Народ доверил им почетное и ответственное дело советского правосудия. Одна из судей, Голда Нафталевна Мирре, в польской тюрьме, просидела 3,5 года за подпольную комсомольскую работу. В панской Польше она была приговорена к 13 годам тюремного заключения. В камере 112 была заключена Эрнестина Бирнбаум. Солнечные лучи никогда не заглядывали в мрачный застенок.
A total of 190,400 were arrested, of which 8,513 were executed. One of the biggest crimes was the Katyn massacre, where in the spring of 1940, 22,000 members of the Polish military and intelligentsia were executed by the NKVD on Stalin's orders. Many people were also taken to these buildings near the railway station and then brought to the platform and shoved into cattle cars and deported to Siberia or Kazakhstan. Many of them would never return. I read that 1/5 of the city's population disappeared. Nearly every family lost someone, and those who disappeared often did not return. This led to a cultural and economic collapse of the city. As Soviet journalists kept writing and teachers kept saying, Poland had fallen and would never rise again. Białystok was on the route of the German advance towards Minsk and fell in German hands late June 1941. Its Jewish inhabitants were murdered and the other people were subjected to harsh Nazi rule. In the summer of 1944, the Red Army undertook the Białystok offensive, which was part of Operation Bagration, and liberated the city. Surprisingly enough, this region was given back to the new Polish state. Contrary to the regions of Brest and Lvov, now Lviv, these remain part of the Soviet Union and a part of Belarus and Ukraine today. If you want to know more about Poland's territorial evolution, you can click right here. Check me out on Patreon, because with your donations I can travel to places like this and make stuff like this. Thank you so much for watching. Do not forget to subscribe, and I'll see you later.